Right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
It's a year after Sherlock Holmes first appeared in print. You've got the Victorian gaslit streets of London. You've also got the appeal of the name, Jack the Ripper.
The murders became famous. Once the name Jack the Ripper had been invented, they became a total sensation.
It was not enough only that the woman should be killed, but also should be mutilated. Be sure about that. Every part of the body should be hacked together.
They were the first sexual serial murders to occur in a major town, a leading capital city, and they were the first to achieve international publicity.
In the history of American crime,
What fascinates people is not the murders themselves, it's the puzzle. Who? Who did it? Why weren't they caught? And it's that puzzle which teases everybody.
England, the West End, city of commerce, culture, and high fashion. A society of wealthy gentlemen in top hats and cutaways. Their wives, gentle ladies. Their children, tended by nannies. Queen Victoria reigns supreme. In contrast, the East End, where 900,000 impoverished people lived in cramped, filthy slums, and entire families were homeless. Whitechapel, the most destitute area of all, is where the murders took place. This outcast community was ignored and reviled by Victorian London.
The East End, having become a dirty, rundown industrial district, now, in a time of economic depression at the end of the 1880s, was an area of overcrowding, misery, and unemployment, and an area where at any time almost any woman might have to prostitute herself as the only way to feed her children. I've talked to person after person from the East End today who said, yes, they always reckoned Grandma had to go out on the streets when time was bad, and nobody thought any of the worse of her for it.
The life of these women, one tends to sometimes forget, is just how brutal and how harsh it was. You could buy one of these women for 3 pennies, or 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread. The price of 3 pennies was fixed because that was what the women would pay for a large glass of gin.
I just wrote to say you would be glad to know I am settled in my new place and going all right up to now. They are very nice people and I have not much to do. I hope you're all right and the boy has work. So goodbye now for the present. Yours truly, Polly. Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are.
Polly Nichols was murdered on the 31st of August 1888. And on that particular day, she'd had 3 customers. But she'd spent the money on gin. So when she turned up at the lodging house to get a bed for the night, not only was she drunk, but she didn't have any money for a bed. But she felt pretty confident about getting a 4th customer because she thought she looked particularly attractive. And the reason she thought she looked so attractive was because she was wearing a new hat. I mean, she was drunk, she's got 5 front teeth missing, but she was wearing this new hat. And the last words of the lodging house keeper were, "See what a jolly bonnet I'm wearing."
August the 31st, 1888 was the first Ripper murder. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, a streetwalker in her early 40s, was found dead in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, at approximately 3:45 in the morning. She had been dead approximately 20 minutes when she was found, and in the mortuary they discovered that not only had her throat been cut, but there was a great gash in her abdomen. Now, these murders became very famous for a most peculiar reason. The very first elections to the London County Council were taking place, and the radicals, the extreme leftists, thought they had a very good chance of winning the East End. The radical newspapers, particularly the Star and the Pall Mall Gazette, two London evening newspapers, realised that if they wrote up the murders, they could draw attention to the terrible social conditions of the East End, and they did. And they sold more papers than anybody had thought possible.
As far as the public attention was concerned, you can see that journalists were absolutely responsible for part of the fear and the fervour. When you look at the papers of the time, you see the lurid front-page illustrations on police news and equally lurid treatment of the subject on the inside. Even the Times fell for it. Even the Times was swept away by Ripper fervour and Ripper fever.
A nameless reprobate.
Half beast, half man is at large.
Deadly, cunning.
Insatiable thirst for blood.
Whitechapel fiends strikes again.
If you could take my unit and I back to 1888 to the crime scene, I would suggest that we focus in on the first homicide. Generally, the first homicide is the focal point, is the area where the subject feels the most comfortable. And that would be the area where either he is employed or where he resides. I believe the subject would go back to the scene, go back there and kind of hang around there and fantasize and relive the crime.
You can have situations where the murderer's standing here, the victim's lying there, the murderer's covered in the victim's blood, he's left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. There's no way you could combine the two. The scientific knowledge didn't exist for that to happen. So literally, you have got to catch the murderer in the act of murder.
On the 8th of September 1888, at 10 to 6 in the morning, the second victim was found. She had been kicked out of her nearby lodging house at midnight for not having the money she needed to pay for her bed. She expected to earn it, but clearly didn't find it, as she was last seen alive at 5:15, negotiating with a client who was probably Jack the Ripper on the pavement outside number 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had been cut. She had been savagely mutilated, disemboweled, and her uterus taken away.
If ever the Ripper was going to be caught, it was then. Because they're out in the backyard and a man in the next door house comes down to the yard, obviously to relieve himself, because this is what the yards were used for. And he's standing there and he hears something fall against the fence and a woman's voice say, "No." Now the fence is only 5 foot high. All he's got to do is look over the fence and he would have seen Chapman with her killer, with the Ripper.
In these extraordinarily difficult cases where a roaming sexual killer attacks people he doesn't know, so you can't follow up people's associates. If he attacks prostitutes, he's attacking women who automatically go off to dark corners with half a dozen strange men every day. How on earth are you going to find which one is doing the killing?
I think by Victorian standards, the investigation into the series of Whitechapel murders was conducted as well as possibly they could manage in those days. They put extra manpower on the streets. They had intensive door-to-door inquiries. All leads were followed up, even ridiculous leads.
Prostitutes described a local man who had been threatening them.
Well, he's short and he's stocky and he's got the blackest hair and a black moustache and the thickest neck you ever saw. He's got a cap and like a leather apron and he waves his knife about and he shouts, "I'll rip you up."
When the Ripper murders began, the Metropolitan Police, they rapidly announced that although they couldn't name him, they didn't even know his name, their principal suspect was a local poor Polish-Jewish immigrant, nicknamed Leather Apron.
Scotland Yard quickly arrested John Pizer as Leather Apron in order to stop the press from printing inflammatory articles about an immigrant man threatening London women. There was no evidence implicating Pizer in the murders, and he was quickly released. But the incident fed ethnic tensions in the East End.
The Irish were resented by the native English. The Irish themselves resented the new influx of Jewish immigrants who settled particularly in the parish of Whitechapel, because that was where the ancient two synagogues of London had always been, and they were racing in, fleeing the pogroms of Russia and Bismarck's clearances of Jews in Silesia.
Onto that Jewish community is projected the idea that it's a Jew that is the Ripper, the murderer, because no Englishman, no East Ender would actually have committed such a crime. So the Jews are already becoming, the immigrant Jew is becoming the scapegoat and the suspect for the Ripper murders.
The police next turned their sights on doctors who performed amputations and surgery. Perhaps the killer who extracted organs from his victims was a doctor.
It is apparently an amputation knife, a late 19th century amputation knife. And certainly it's the sort of weapon which could have done the murders.
A number of medical students whose brains had been unhinged were being sought after. And in fact, there was a time when to be a doctor and to carry a bag around made you an enormously suspicious person.
The idea that the Ripper was a doctor came from one and one only of the medics who examined the bodies. Dr. Baxter Phillips, after examining Annie Chapman's body, said this was the work of an expert.
The abdomen had been entirely laid open. The intestines, severed from their mesenteric attachments, had been lifted out of the body and placed on the shoulder of the corpse, whilst the pelvis, the uterus, and its appendages had been entirely removed. Obviously the work of an expert, of one at least who had such knowledge of anatomical examinations as to be enabled to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife.
The people at the top had the medical evidence surveyed by Dr. Bond of Westminster, a police surgeon they trusted implicitly, and Bond's full report on all the medical evidence in the case said no skill at all, not even the skill of a butcher.
After two ghastly murders, many concerned citizens wrote letters to Scotland Yard suggesting ways to catch the murderer. The most popular idea was to have armed police pose as prostitutes. Then, on September 29, a note arrived, purportedly from the killer himself. The signature was brilliant.
Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. That joke about the leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on oars and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled.
Scotland Yard was now very fearful that the mysterious Whitechapel fiend would soon strike again.
My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The name, Jack the Ripper. Probably invented by a journalist, certainly first appearing in the Dear Boss letter. But what a name for an undiscovered ghoul.
Charles Warren, head of Scotland Yard, was under siege. The killer was still at large. His superiors were furious, and the public had no confidence in him. The radical press wanted him out. 1 square mile in the centre of London had its own police force. The City of London Police and its Commissioner, Major Henry Smith, were about to be drawn into the hunt for Jack the Ripper.
Extra reinforcements were put into the area. And also, it seems silly now, although I'm sure the intention was well meant, notice was given out advising the prostitutes to stay off the street.
24 hours later, the worst fears of the police were realized.